explain, but I should begin by making a confession to you. I use a long word. I'm a bicameralist. I believe I'm a bicameralist. That's a 50-cent word at least, isn't it, in political science. I believe certainly for large and complex countries that are constitutional democracies, you do need two chambers. If you're very small, like New Zealand, perhaps it's not so important. But we're a big, sprawling country. We're very complex, and we should have bicameralism. I'm absolutely convinced of that. So I have no time for the NDP's proposal. Lots of time, I'm not an NDPer, but lots of things they advocate are good. And I just before I leave the NDP, I have never heard them on why they want to move Canada away from bicameralism, other than it's not an elected house. Well, lots of great institutions aren't elected. And that's not a strong enough reason for deviating from bicameralism. It's really just about impossible. You may know one, but I don't know a large constitutional democracy that tries to get along with one chamber in its legislature. There's lots of arguments about what the second chamber should be. Should it be appointed in some way or elected in some way? And there I'll make my second confession of the evening. I'm by and large not a fan of two elected chambers. The Senate I know best next to ours is an elected Senate. It's the Australian Senate. And I'm a huge admirer of it. I've spent a lot of time in it. I've even addressed it. And it does a reasonably good job. But in Australia, there's a distinct lack of checks and balances on government. They have nothing like a Charter of Rights. They do not have the kind of vigorous provincial governments that we have. And they probably need something like that in Australia. But one thing you should know about, and it's Triple E elected Senate, equal number of senators for each Australian state, full power, same power as the House of Representatives, except as here, you can't introduce money bills in the Australian Senate, and equal. You really have to figure out how to handle deadlocks, because and there's been no work at all in Canada, even among those who want an elected Senate, including the Bert Browns of the world and the people who constructed a proposal for one in the Charlottetown court. If you have two elected houses, you're going to have collisions, particularly if one, like the Australian, has a proportional representation system, which is had since '49. No party has a majority in that house, and usually the opposition can get together and on almost any measure combine to defeat the government. I love watching the Australian Senate in action. It's one of the liveliest legislative bodies I've ever watched in action. So I'm not dead set against elected second chambers, but I kind of am more of a fan of two other second chambers. They're very different, both appointed, the German upper house and the British. You hear what he said? The British House of Lords. How the hell could you be an admirer of the House of Lords? Well, I can for a couple of reasons. One, it's had its wings clipped, its powers reduced twice, so really all it has now is a suspension. It could suspend a bill that's gone through the House of Commons for a year, but no more. But what it can really do is stimulate a kind of public discussion that didn't take place in the House, particularly, this poll right now, if there's a one-party majority government in the House of Commons. The other thing is they have reformed the House of Lords, not to make it elected, although that could still happen. Oddly enough, it's the Conservatives in England who talk more about electing some of the peers than Labour. Right now, The reform is that the peers themselves, I think it's only 100, the peers elect the peers. They don't all get to sit there just because they have a title. They elect their best, and believe it or not, folks, there's some really, really bright peers. Some of their ladies as well as lords. There are also some appointed lords, and there's and this is very germane to the proposal that Justin Trudeau has put in front of Canadians. There's an advisory appointment commission to try and get partisanship out of the appointment of members of the House of Lords, and it's become a politically very diverse body with very strong people, a kind of house of the talents, not afraid to take up big issues and take a different position than the House of Lords, because it doesn't have full power, and it can only be effective by persuasion, by persuading the public that there's another side to the legislation, there's some problems with it. So you can see where I'm going to go in terms of the best kind of Senate reform in Canada is to take the partisanship out of selecting people to be summoned by the Governor General to sit in the Senate. I just give you the man who maybe made this point best. His name is John A. Macdonald. It's the one quote I brought here tonight. It's a Confederation debate. And here's what our first Prime Minister to be at this time, said about the Canadian Senate he was designing. He said it must be an, wait for it, an independent house. That's a crucial word, huh? Having a free action of its own, for it is only valuable as being a regulatory body calmly considering the legislation initiated by the popular branch. Calmly considering the legislation initiated by the popular branch, and preventing any hasty or ill-considered legislation which may come from that body. And then he added these words: but it will never set itself against the deliberate and understood wishes of the people. If there's a popular measure that the country has really elected a government to bring in, the Senate is, in his view, to block it. I thought those were wonderful words when I read them, but like so many prime ministers, oh my God, when they get to power, they're bitterly disappointed. This guy, he was a great man. I mean, I'm not here to trash John A. Macdonald. I go to John A.'s birthday and everything, great man. But he undermined totally. He undermined totally his own recipe, his own definition, his own prescription, his own aspiration for Canadians of what an upper house should be, by right away going to political friends, people who are of his political persuasion, not always, but most of the time. And he set the pattern for all subsequent prime ministers. And it isn't that people chosen for political reasons are no good. I would never say that. But they're not the only good people to exercise review, legislative review. They're not the only good people to conduct policy inquiries into matters that the federal government legislates on. There are other terrific people in our society, people who have accomplished a lot in all walks of life, people from minority groups that are underrepresented. And if you just stick to partisan politics as your number one criterion in selecting who you're going to tell the Governor General to summon, you're going to deprive Canadians of the kind of membership in an upper house that they ought to have for it to be a good house of review. And so, having lost the opportunity to have an elected Senate, at least because the Supreme Court said you've got to do that with 7 provinces, and I think the Supreme Court got that right. And having said you have to have all the provinces agreeing if you're going to get rid of it, and you know, the cow will jump over the moon before that happens, I can assure you that. We're down to changes that I think can be very significant to improve the Senate and get it back to exactly the ideal that MacDonald gave us. We don't have to reinvent the purpose of the Senate. We have to get prime ministers who are sold on that purpose and will carry it out. I know some have said that the Supreme Court's decision at the end of April is so wide-sweeping that any change in selection, even a prime minister who got up and gave us all a heart attack by saying he'd no longer appoint just political friends, he will go out and get advice from maybe committees and provinces on outstanding people in each province and territory. You can't even do that. That's Craig Scott's position on NDP. Craig's a good friend. I think that's just sour grapes. They lost their reform. I don't think the Supreme Court did not say any tiny change in the method of selection. Any prime minister who doesn't just go to the PMO and his political pals and keep doing that, any change from deviation from that is a constitutional change that must have 7 provinces. Our court, it might be changed such as I'm suggesting, might be challenged by somebody who doesn't like it, and you can always challenge anything in the courts, but I think it would survive the kind of change that Justice Trudeau points to, but many of us have written about. David Smith's superb book, the best book we have in the Senate, Canadian Bicameralism, is by David Smith. His suggestion about a system of getting the partisanship out of finding the best people to nominate for the Governor General this summer. Makes that Mel Capp, a recent clerk of the Privy Council, I thought wrote an excellent Globe and Mail op-ed. Our friend, my friend, maybe not yours, Tom Flanagan, has written several. He's a very good pal of mine, wrong on a lot of issues, but right in this one is in favor of it. So there's a lot of people over the years who put this idea forward. Mr. Trudeau did that in February. I liked the general direction. I didn't like the way he did it. I thought it should have been done he should have had much more consultation with his colleagues. There's no need to kick the senators out of the caucus. That's just childish. I'm frank. I like Justin's a nice young man, but I am condescending in making that remark. That was silly. That was just silly. Just damn silly. Now, and there's something you have to think about in doing that. Kicking them out of the caucus means they can't be in the cabinet, I take it. Now, Prime Minister Harper has just made sure that there's no cabinet member in the Senate by Marjorie Le Breton, who used to represent the government and was a cabinet minister in the Senate, as Tory House Leader in the Senate, being replaced by Augustin Gall. And he is explicitly, as Mr. Harper explained, not in the cabinet. And that means there's no one in, if the Senate want to ask what is the government policy on this or that, there's no cabinet minister there to give an account. So there's no direct line of accountability of the government to the Senate. And the Senate is an equally important chamber in making policy. It has full power, legislative power. And that's a bad idea. The Charlottetown Accord proposals have the same mistake built into them. No cabinet members in the Senate. You could run and win a big provincial election, but you couldn't be in the cabinet. Dumb, and you can't get much dumber than that. I mean, really, that is just silly. There should be a few senators, not a lot, in the cabinet. And one reason is you need some accountability. Well, I'll turn it over to my good friend, Andrew Eggleston.